Oh, is it? Content is being sent to a third party. Got it. Good.
Interesting. Zoom knows that it's
Oh,
being streamed too.
meeting is now streaming live on YouTube.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I
Sent
like that
to.
it gives you the option to leave. Nope. Don't want anything about that.
Let's see. Or can I see that we are live? Let's see. YouTube. Um, oh, yeah, I'm seeing that we are live. Let me click on this live. That we are live. Let's see. Oh, there we are, folks.
Is everything good? Like the title and everything?
Communication skills and cybersecurity. Whopping two watching now. Hi, folks. Yeah, I'm seeing that we are live. Let me click on this. Getting the feedback. Yeah, everything looks good.
Okay, let's kick this off. Hello, everybody. This is OffSec's first YouTube stream, so really excited to be here today. I'm Jeremy. I go by Harbinger, and I support our content development and strategy teams here at OffSec. And I'm really excited for our guest today. Our guest is Eugene Lin, otherwise known as Space Raccoon. How are you, Eugene?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. So our topic today is really communication skills in cybersecurity. Before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Let's start with who you are, how did you get into cybersecurity, and what is it that you do today?
Yeah. So I'm Eugene, but I go by Space Raccoon Online. That's my hacker handle. And I've been in the industry for about 5 years now. I really started off, as a white hat hacker, participating in bug bounties, but also CTFs, and being really part of the community. And over time, I started out my job as a pen tester in the offensive security industry. And now I am also building a security program. In Singapore, and that has brought me into all kinds of places. From finding bugs to now trying to squash them, and it's been an interesting journey so far.
Nice. Where does Space Raccoon come from?
It was just this really weird cartoon I saw wandering around. It was called like Eugene the Raccoon, and um, the description said that it was the raccoon from space. So I used it as my GitHub handle, and ended up being my kind of like tech username for most things nowadays. But
Nice,
yeah,
nice,
people always
nice.
ask that. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, so of course, building a security program for Singapore means that you are certainly qualified to talk about communication as it relates to cybersecurity. Um, Before we dive into the subjects at hand, why do you think that why do you think that this is even a conversation to be had? Like, maybe in the medical field, they talk about communication in medicine, and in law, they talk about communication in law. But why is it important for us in cybersecurity to even talk about communication in the first place?
Yeah, I think there are many layers to this because I think at the heart of it, I think the goal of the cybersecurity industry is to make things more secure, to make sure that the tech runs fine, that bugs don't happen, and a lot of it hinges on working with people, right? We
Right.
got to talk to developers, we got to talk to stakeholders, we got to talk to our own peers as well because there's so much going on in the field of cybersecurity, so much evolving. And if you want to convince people to make their products more secure, if you want to make people understand the severity of a single bug, that's where communication comes in. So I think, it's kind of routine to say that cybersecurity is a team sport, but exactly because it's such a team sport, that's where communication becomes so important for cybersecurity.
So where do you think the first challenge is in cybersecurity? Communication, that is.
Wow. Yeah. So I think I like to go back to like where, when I first started out as, a bug hunter. And I think a lot of people get started in the industry in similar ways. They are either a level 1 analyst or they are finding bugs, and you get so excited, you focus on one bug, right? And I think from there, you try to get people to take notice of it. And that's your first experience with communications in cybersecurity, where you're trying to write a report, a vulnerability report. And I think that's where actually a lot of people face challenges in the first place, because they're overly focused on the technical details and they don't, communicate impact. And there's a lot of frustration that starts from there. So, I mean, if you look at a lot of like disclosed reports, on any of the bug bounty platforms, you'll find lots of cases where communication went wrong. But a lot of it also just comes from the fact that people are new to the industry. This is the first time they found a bug, and that's where you're going to get a lot of these early mistakes. So that's what you usually start with in cybersecurity, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like all our training and education goes into how do you find these bugs, and we take all these people and put them into programs so that they are level 1 analysts and junior pen testers, and they have those skills, but they haven't necessarily been trained on what to do next. How do you find the journey from, let's say, having that skill set to realizing, oh, I do need to write this report in a way that the receiver is going to understand? What's that like? How do you take someone through that skill set?
Yeah, so this is, I think this is super important because I think it's definitely like an underrated skill. And you're totally right in that, when we try to get people to join the industry, the first thing we teach is like find a bug, right?
Of course.
And and obviously like that's a core technical skill, and then there's a lot less said about, okay, you found a bug, like what's next in the bigger picture of things.
Right.
And I just remember that I think what really got me going early on was that a lot of the programs that I reported vulnerabilities to, they said like, oh, this is such a well-written report. Here's a bonus, right? It's so well-written that we could triage it super quickly, and we'd love to like give you more money for that report. And so that really got me thinking like, actually, writing well, communicating well is valuable. It has value in this industry. And the reason is because it saves time. People get to the vulnerability faster. They don't spend time, man hours, like trying to figure out what you're talking about. And that really kind of drove home the value of communication to me. So that became something really early. And a lot of the, I think, successful, white hats out there actually do share a lot about, how communication is important in report writing and so on.
So it's not, we have like a list of topics we're going to talk about. It's not on our list, but since we're already speaking about report writing, let's stay on that topic for a little bit. Let's say you're making a report, let's say for a bug bounty. What do you think are the top 3 things that are the most important to communicate in that report? Yeah,
I think there's a lot we can learn from like intelligence report writing, right? From the intelligence sector, where they really do focus on bottom line upfront, like what is the key thing that the stakeholder wants. And so I think the number one thing that you got to be aware of is who's at the other end of this, reading your report. A lot of times, like we assume it's someone who's exactly like us, who knows a lot about vulnerability. But in reality, a lot of the times, the person at the other end is a triager, right? Who may have a lot of expertise in, triaging bugs, understanding what a bug is, but they may not be as familiar as you are with the system you're testing. So really knowing the audience is important, writing so that you explain the parts that you assume the other person might know, but they don't actually know. And I think the second thing is then really about bottom line up front, like what is the impact of this vulnerability? What does it mean for the business? What does it mean for the application? Can you access user data, right? They don't really care if, I mean, it's cool, right? But they don't really care if it's an SSRF or SQL injection as much as this is how does it impact the user data at the end of the
Right.
day? And bringing that, I think, is one of the most important things you can put in a report.
So when we talk about communication, we often talk about the speaker, in this case, the report writer. But you mentioned something that's really important, which is about what the stakeholders and the readers care about. How do you think security people, technical people doing the job should think about receiving information and listening?
Yeah, I think that is like empathy is one of the most important things in communication. And I think a lot of the times, I think the security industry as a whole, we tend to operate in a vacuum, in a silo, like, security special, super cool hacking skills. But in reality, I think I read a really good book recently, Chaos Security Engineering, where it was discussed that security isn't that special, right? The problems that we try to solve are essentially issues in software, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and there are a lot of disciplines out there, like reliability engineers, who kind of tackle the same problems. So it starts with having empathy, where it's not just a secret skill that we have, but we are also working with developers who may know a lot more about certain things. They might have noticed that vulnerability, but they may not have picked it up. How they may not have known how to fix it well, and being able to start from that perspective really grounds the kind of communication that you have, so that it's not just you talking down to someone or trying to get them to understand something that they may not really be interested in, but speaking in their language is one of the key parts of communication here.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The fact that security has this sort of elite connotation, like fighting the bad guys, and there's this superhero connotation to it. I think it makes people feel very sort of, I don't really mean this in a bad way, but egotistical, not in the grandiose sense, but in the attachment sense of people in this industry are very close to their work. They feel very attached to it because there's this sort of emotionality attached to it. And I think you're right. If you can sort of let go and realize where the other person in the chain is coming from and what they're skilled at and what their expertise is in, then it goes a really long way. In security, this often gets magnified because of pressure. Well, I did the same thing. I said insecurity, but really in business in general, there's different kinds of pressure that can be sometimes intentionally, but often just passively applied to a job role, to a team, to a department, to a company. And security, again, I want to avoid like pretending that security is special, but there is often this, there's a pressure from the outside. There's a pressure of like, okay, the attackers are here now. They're doing something now. What do we do? Panic. How do you think about communicating under pressure, and specifically under the pressure of a potential attacker or a potential threat or a vulnerability that's active right now?
Yeah, I think that's really central, right? Because especially for like incident responders, when you're and I've been in those situations as well, where you're unsure of what the signal really is, and you got to make a decision. You got to communicate to everyone else, get the information you need. You got to talk to developers saying, okay, can you give me those logs? Let me see what's going on. And a lot of it, I think, then just boils down to having really good playbooks beforehand, right? You have to be prepared. And so that even under pressure, you don't compromise on the principles of why you're doing something, why you're asking for a certain log, for example. And this is clear to everyone else in the chain as well, because those have been communicated beforehand. So yeah, communication just doesn't have to happen in the moment, right? I think a big part of communication is preparation and communicating principles, being consistent in your principles. So I think, with my security program, I always communicate that one of my principles is, good intentions don't work, mechanisms do.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
Say it. Yeah, right. So I think one big part of cybersecurity is, when bad things happen, right? It's very easy and very common for us to blame the human, right? It's like, oh, you clicked the link, or oh, you put a bug in your code. That's pretty bad, right? And this was something I learned in the book I mentioned earlier as well. It's just that, I think that's the easiest explanation to blame the human, but it's also something that other industries have moved away from, where you kind of step out and it's like, okay, so why did the developer put that vulnerable code in there in the first place? Were there not enough safeguards? And you guys, had a conversation with Clint, I think a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And was there not enough safeguards? Was there, too much production pressure at the time? No one was checking your code, right? And that helps you kind of step back from blaming humans, which is, again, a very bad way of communication, a very negative way, and focus on the mechanisms. And it's something I believe strongly in cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we don't do enough because there's that element of like, oh, you click the link, haha, right? But actually, were there multiple layers of defenses that have failed beforehand? Did your spam filters work? Did your early alerts for your EDR raise that download? That could be worked on. They're more productive to work on. And so I think when we think about communication cybersecurity, a lot of it, like a big part of cybersecurity is also like user education, right? Mm-hmm. But user education is difficult, which is why I do prefer to kind of step back from that and focus on the mechanisms that we can build in the program.
Yeah, I like that because you can acknowledge that, yes, you probably shouldn't click the link, and yes, you should validate your input, and yes, you should do output encoding. But those are not the only mechanisms in place. There are some mechanisms, but not the only ones. And if we're serious about our principles, like defense in depth, if we really mean what we say, then we would say, okay, but that's only one small part of the chain. What are the other parts that also failed? Because all of them have to fail, or many of them have to fail in order for a vulnerability to get through. What are the sort of low-hanging fruit? And I think you're right that focusing not on an individual, but on the system as a whole is both more productive, and that will probably fix things faster and more consistently over time. But it's also humanizing. It is it's acknowledging that people make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. And if our security relies on everybody getting everything right all the time, then we might as well just stop because we're not going to succeed.
Yeah, totally. And Clint had a really great metaphor, I think, where he was talking about driving a car, right? Like,
yes,
developers driving a car, they're responsible for driving safely, to getting to the right destination, delivering the product. But cybersecurity people, we build safety devices, like the seatbelt or the auto navigation, right? And a big part of how we design that is built on good communication, right? And the user interface, when we build, say, static analysis tools, the user experience is so important for these mechanisms as well. And I think I think the cybersecurity industry is also, I mean, I don't want to paint it as a brush, but it's also pretty well known for being very like building a lot of tools that don't have great user interfaces. And that actually is a hindrance to actually securing the product.
What do you mean user interface? You're just using the command line, no?
Yeah.
But that's exactly
it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This whole thing, sure. But I think at the end of the day, that's a big thing that we miss, is that communication is not just, of course, writing, speaking. Those are important as well, but also non-verbal communication, design, that also comes in.
Yeah. Okay, we talked about report writing, but there's other kinds of documentation that security people have to build, such as documentation or articles about what happened that they want the company to know about in the future. How do you think about that skill set, and how's it different than a straight up report?
Yeah, I think this kind of builds on the point earlier about like the tools that we build, right? Mm-hmm. I think security people love building tools. We're really good at scripting. I think one of the hallmarks when I sit through like a coding kind of challenge that a security person is doing is that they have a very like scripting focus a lot of the time. So we get the job done, but we don't document well, right? The technical documentation there's a lot of hidden stuff. If you look at some of the most popular like hacking tools out there and you take a look at the documentation, it's not a good time most of the time. And so I think when it comes to technical documentation, you really have to like think about being clear not just to yourself, but to future users. And within the organization itself, it's really important to explain. So I'm a big fan of ADR, like architectural decision records, where you write down exactly why you chose a specific architectural decision in designing this tool or your platform. So that in the future, if someone like kind of wonders like, oh, okay, why did we pick this particular framework, or why did we pick this particular approach to detecting maybe a malware that's running? It's explainable, and so it's also you can improve on it, right? So if the original decision doesn't make sense, then people who come after you can improve on it, can change it, rather than just scripting your way to getting things done, but not really building for the future.
Do you think that the skill sets that people develop in scripting as good scripters, let's say, can help them in creating this kind of robust documentation?
I think a lot of like when you do like scripting versus like building, when you think about scripting, building a tool, a lot of the documentation that comes with it is that you kind of have to explain the structures of the data that you're using, right? And the interfaces between the various parts of your program. So yeah, I'm not sure, because it may sound a bit weird for me, but like over time, like many of the tools you see these days have moved away from like Python scripts, right?
Sure.
And they're moving towards like Golang, some Rust even. And you see that because it's a lot more maintainable. And I don't want to start like a whole discussion on like which programming language is the best. But your choice in what programming language you write in, what framework you use, does factor a lot into how easily documented it can be. So those are important choices to make as well when you first start.
As you're talking, Eugene, I'm thinking of this frame, because I can imagine a lot of people listening to this and just being sort of eye-rolly and resistant and like, okay, yeah, you're saying security is also about these soft skills and communication, but really what you want me to do is find bugs, and all this other stuff is noise. And so I'm thinking that maybe there's a frame in which we can show people that it's actually part of the job in the same way. So I'm gonna say something that I don't think I've expressed before. I'm just thinking of this now, and I just want to get your reaction to it. Feel free to poke holes. I'm just interested to hear what you think. So security in a lot of ways is about finding the truth, right? So you have a web application, and everybody involved with that web application has a model in their head about how it works. And they think that it works one way, and then the security tester comes along and shows that actually it works in this other way, and that way happens to be bad. And I think that if you think of your job as a security person as going to discover and then speak the truth, you can recognize that just discovering the truth is not enough. You have to then communicate it. Does this make any sense, or am I like going off into some wild other direction?
No, I think that's really true. And at heart, I'm still like a hacker, right? And I think one of the greatest, like the fun parts of being a hacker is that it almost feels like you're communicating with the developer or whoever built the program that you're trying to hack, right? You're kind of figuring out their habits. You are maybe, if it's open source, you're reading the code, the to-dos, where it's like, add validation here, and they just never got around to it. And in that sense, I think it's really about, I think that's where it's so powerful, and something that we kind of miss sometimes is that actually as hackers, we have such a good understanding of the target, right? Sometimes even better than the developers themselves, because we notice patterns, we study them. We're like, oh, it seems like you use this function to sanitize that you forgot to use somewhere else. And so a big part of that is then how do you bring that up, communicate that truth that you discovered to the developer or the company. And I guess for me, then is what's more important is then realizing like who you're talking to at the end of the day. Are you talking to a triager who isn't as connected to the code. Are you talking to like a non-technical person who might not appreciate you saying like, oh, there's this function here and there, or you really are directly interfacing with the developer themselves, and those are
Right.
all very important decisions to make.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the concept of inferential distance?
No.
Okay, so that's when let's say you are, I mean, I'll use a real point. You have your OSEE. You did our AWE class, and you have your OSEE, and that's great. And I have like beginner, maybe start of intermediate exploit development skills. And so if you were to come to me and say like, oh, hey, look, I found this really cool bug and it relies on the stuff that I learned in AWE, and you just sort of explain it in your words, it's probably going to fly over my head because I don't have the same context and background as you do. And in your head, there's a lot of background information that's just given. I guess the another way of saying this problem is like the more information you have, the more knowledge you have on a given domain, the more the gap that you need to cover is when you need to explain something to somebody else. So where am I taking this? How do you think about communicating to someone, let's say somebody technical, but who you know doesn't have the same experience or background or context as you do?
Yeah, I think I've seen this a lot as well. In conferences, right? So ShmooCon, DevCon, Black Hat, and there's always this moment in a conference when in one of these talks, right, when they're talking about some really really cool stuff they're doing, they're hitting the main vulnerability, and you can kind of see in the audience like half of them are going to be like nodding. There's the realization is dawning that some really cool stuff has gone down, and it's an awesome bug, and the other half is just going to be like staring, and that's the kind of bridge that I think is really hard to navigate, because you have to pitch to a large audience for conferences, and in this context, then what do you want them to understand? Do you want them to understand, for example, that say there's this very esoteric like function in how maybe RPC calls are made in Windows, that maybe 10% of your audience will know, right? Or do you want to kind of step back a little bit and make them understand that the RPC is such an old protocol that there's a lot of legacy, there's a lot of weird like stuff from the 1980s. Encryption is done in a certain way. And that's what you want to communicate. And it's easier to then you can reach maybe like 60 to 80% because then you kind of tweak the information that you present to get them to understand that.
Right.
Yeah. So it's all about like closing the distance based on what you want to communicate to people and what you think is important. And to some people, like, yeah, just showing that I found this super cool like bug in, I don't know, this assembly that I've looked at. Or it could be like, I found this really cool theme. So I think for me, the kind of stuff that I put up for conferences, I really like to communicate, analyze protocols as a whole, and kind of take away bigger takeaways from that. It's like, oh, the internet runs on the iCalendar format that was like, I don't know, like 30 years old or something crazy like that. And that's what I want to communicate. But whether you want to communicate about that or something a bit more granular, that's up to you.
Yeah. I like that you talk about presentations. There's a big culture of presentations in tech and in cybersecurity specifically. What advice would you give to somebody who maybe hasn't done a presentation before or hasn't spoken in front of a conference, but wants to develop that skill set? How would you suggest that they take their first steps?
Yeah, I think it's really about, I think in the research field and the presentation field can be intimidating because there's so many like 0 days out there. People like to share the presentations like, oh, I found X 0 days and this is what I'm sharing today. But I think what makes a conference presentation stand out is knowing something small really, really well, diving really deep. And so you don't have to find 0 days in Microsoft Office to be an interesting presentation, right? Maybe you can talk about this one database format that has been around for 40 years, used in like weird applications, but it's still cool. and for me, like now that I've started to help with like reviewing conference applications, that's really the novelty factor. I think is one of the biggest things that we look out for, and that gives people, I think, it shows effort because it takes effort to like write something new and
Yeah.
original, as compared to like sharing about latest techniques that you have used but everyone knows. That's not as interesting.
Yeah, it's very challenging to carve a space for yourself. I just read a book, and it talks a little bit about writing. And there's a character in the book who just can't figure out what to write, and she goes to the professor and is like, "I can't do it." And the professor says, "What do you mean? There's so much to write about." And she goes, "But I can't figure it out." And he says, "Okay, but just start with this building. Start looking at this specific brick. And if you can look in really, 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 really tiny detail at one little brick, then maybe you'll figure out how to write about the whole building." And of course, she goes ahead and does that. Do you think that there's a space in conferences for people to talk about their brick, the thing that they know, even if other people know about it, even if it's not something brand new, just to get people this experience? Do you think that there are conferences open to that sort of like kind of Toastmasters type of club type of thing?
Yeah, I think there's yeah, I think there's definitely like really, it's really important to encourage people to talk about specific experiences. So I mentioned, there's the novelty factor, but you're totally right in that even if it's not something new, but if it has been applied to a very specific scenario that's interesting, um, say, cross-site scripting, it's been done everywhere. It's not super impactful for a lot of people, but maybe just a really cool, like in-depth thing where you like how I discovered cross-site scripting in this website that had really weird sanitization, where I had to like look into the code to do a white box review to figure out like how it's working, and then eventually got it to pop, right? I mean, it may not be the most impactful. It's not like a 0 day in Microsoft Office or whatever, but it's still cool because I think the community as a whole appreciates like cool stories, right? We're all people driven by stories. We love narrative. So that can be another way that you just sitting around a campfire, right, sharing like, I hacked this, and it doesn't have to be new. It doesn't have to be like world ending, but it can be entertaining and interesting and fun for everyone.
Ironically, cross-site scripting is my favorite bug to use as an example for a non-technical audience because it's so intuitive. You can show them a browser and be like, look, this is where you would make your comment on the blog post, and here's what happens if I put in something that looks like Squiggly Duke, and they go, oh, I could have done that. Like, yeah, it's just a website. Do you have any particular bugs or applications or things that like you like to use to explain something to let's say a non-technical audience?
Yeah, actually, that's a really interesting point because I think a lot of people in the industry have come up against this thing where it's like, how do I explain like what is my favorite vulnerability to explain to a non-technical audience? And my experience was actually pretty challenging for cross-site scripting, right? Because there's actually, I think you mentioned like inferential distance.
Yep.
Like, so in order to like explain cross-site scripting, yeah, sure, you can explain like the injection, but then you also have to explain like how HTTP requests work, right? And how servers put them in HTML, and then you have to explain what HTML is, right? And so actually, like my favorite would actually be SQL injection, so SQL injections, right? It's not as common nowadays, but I think in some ways the syntax of SQL makes it easier to explain. It's like, oh, you get fetching something from a database, right? And you can map it to a HTTP request. And there's less kind of background knowledge needed. It's interesting that you mentioned cross-site scripting because I've actually, like, I think a lot of people, like, I initially thought that would be the easiest to explain to an audience. And then I tried it and I was like, maybe it wasn't a good presentation, but I found that difficult.
To the contrary, I think this is a really good example. I'm glad you have a different answer. For our audience, we didn't plan this question. We didn't plan any of these questions. But I'm glad you have a different answer because it also points out that different people can communicate about different things more or less effectively. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that you will explain SQL injection better than I will. And it's interesting how, you know, your own experiences as a communicator drive you towards being better or worse at talking about different things. So we'll compare notes after. I'm interested to hear how you explain SQL injection to somebody non-technical. Going a little bit tangential, because I really don't like this term technical and non-technical. I use it all the time because it points at kind of this, it points at this sort of truism that doesn't quite carve reality at its proper joints, but it's still useful because you can kind of still separate people that way. But I don't like it because it puts people in a box and it makes them feel like they have to stay in that box. I used to consider myself non-technical. I didn't do the math and science track in high school. I thought that I wasn't good at math and that I didn't like science. And it took me 5 to 10 years to realize, like, actually, I really like math and I really like science, and shifting my self-conception to be, oh yeah, actually, you are technical, whatever that means, was really challenging. Do you have experience taking, let's say, non-technical people under your wing and getting them to realize that, hey, yeah, this security stuff or technical stuff is something they can do? And if so, how did you go about that?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that as well, because I feel like I came from a similar kind of background or journey as well, because I started out as a humanities student. I did history.
Nice.
And actually, I feel like it's almost like my secret mission at work now is that I want to get people interested in cybersecurity, even if they're not cybersecurity experts, even if they're not even like developers, have never touched a line of code before. And a big part of that is really about demystifying security, because I think when we kind of make security like special, right?
Magic,
And you know, in some ways it is special, but it's not magic, right? And then it actually weakens security for the organization as a whole, because everyone's just like, oh, it's just like magic, voodoo, spooky stuff.
right.
That they don't want to touch, and they don't get involved in it. And so my experience with that has definitely been challenging, and it's something I'm still working on, because, for example, I will be like, oh, you know, use these starter like online CTFs to get started, right? And then I realized that there's actually so much more that we need to teach. There's HTTP, we got to teach web requests, we got to teach HTML. So I think for me, like one of the better experiences has been when I start with something they use, they know, right? Recently, I had like I gave a talk on like finding vulnerabilities in encryption used in desktop software. Not the most interesting subject to a general audience, but then I was like, hey, you know, open your laptop right now and see if you have this software, right? And you know, it's a pretty common piece of software, so a number of people would have that. I was like, okay, cool. Do you know that, you know, because of the way they put the secret key in this software, that anyone could have decoded, you know, this piece of data on your computer, and that makes it a lot more real, and it makes them a lot more. And so it's just really like learning by doing. I think is far more important. I think for me, when they can do something right on their desktop.
Yeah. Yeah, giving people an experience and not just words and knowledge is really important, especially when you're on that cusp of like not identifying strongly with something. Being able to show somebody like, look, this is you, this is your computer, it's your phone, it's your whatever it is. That's really helpful. I used to teach karate to kids and to adults, and especially with adults, literally like helping them move would often wake something up where they'd be like, oh, this is how I engage that muscle. And kids, you don't need to do that with. Kids can just sort of like watch, and I'm generalizing, but many kids can just like watch you do something and they'll copy it. And it's fantastic. It's amazing. But the older you get, at least in my experience teaching, the more you had to be sort of handheld through.
Right.
I wonder if, you know, as the security industry grows and more people get into this field, that the calls for more hands-on experiences has to do with this sort of generality that, like, as adult learners, we need this hands-on experience. We need to feel it. We need to be part of it in order to really understand it. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really like important because nowadays it's about lifelong learning, about upskilling as you go. And I think for a while, like the cybersecurity industry, like cybersecurity engineers used to be like a level 2 kind of a specialization that
Yeah.
if you started out as a software engineer and then you became a security engineer. So there was a lot of like background information and knowledge. And now, as the industry has expanded, we're getting a lot of people entering security as level 1 entry level roles. And that means they don't have a lot of experience. And that means that there's a lot of things that we assume that they should know are only words on paper for a lot of people. So just having that kind of daily practice, I'm not sure if there's a way. I mean, obviously, like OffSec has the playground and other products that work with that. But if there's a way that they have like a karate class after every day, right, in some form of another that they can work on.
Yeah. I think this is why, for example, many people struggle to learn an instrument without an actual teacher holding their hand and having them actually move. Because while you can learn that way, having not only an example but like extra hands, I think is invaluable. And yes, I mean, I wasn't going to, but I will say OffSec, of course, our labs and our cyber ranges allow us to put people in an environment where they get to and have to do the thing that they will do in the real world. And that kind of experience, doing a lab is probably more valuable than reading 5 modules. I'm generalizing. Some people will for sure read 5 modules and get more out of it. But for me, for sure, in my role as content dev manager, I will often read our content, but I don't actually understand it. I'm often reading just for clarity and vision and voice, but I don't actually understand it until I open the lab and do it. Okay, we have one more official subject that we wanted to get to, which is a really cool one. Receiving and providing feedback. How do you think about feedback, let's say among a technical team, so a team of security analysts or a team of pen testers, and then providing and receiving feedback from the rest of the business?
Yeah, I think especially like now in an environment where I'm not just surrounded by security people, right? So I used to be from a very big security department, and now I'm building a security program. So I'm a lot more in touch with, I think, the end users, the developers that whose stuff I'm also helping to secure. I think that has become so much more important. And receiving feedback, then I think it's important to take almost like a user research kind of approach to it, because a lot of the feedback that you get can be implicit, right? Like maybe you get a lot of questions about a particular part of your security tool that you just rolled out, a lot of problems in there, and not everyone is just going to go up to you and be like, hey, your design for this tool sucks, right? And that's why you're getting so many questions. So it's really about being very attentive to kind of indirect feedback and being proactive about either measuring that kind of feedback or even just going out and asking for that feedback. So yeah, I think especially for security, like a bad habit or a bad pattern would be then building a tool, mandating that everyone uses that tool, and then just sitting back and be like, my numbers went down, the number of vulnerabilities went down, right? But on the back end, maybe people are trying to like remove false positives. They're just ignoring all the alerts. There's lots of hours spent on that, and I think a bad habit would then just be ignoring that kind of metrics or that as kind of feedback. And we really have to be a bit more proactive about that. I think when we kind of say security, like a lot of times in many organizations that have been used to a compliance kind of model, they're just like, oh, I'll just accept it because it's for my own good, right? And that's good for security because it's easy to roll out something. But then you miss out on a lot of this important feedback that you need. As for giving feedback, I think one of the best ways I've seen or received feedback or gotten feedback was being asked questions. So instead of being like, your product doesn't work, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, is your product doing the thing that's supposed to do? Like, or why do you think it's not? Right. And I'm
Right.
led to get the conclusion. I think that's important, and I kind of feel more ownership about the feedback I've gotten. So I think that's a great way to provide feedback to others. It's a less direct way, can be a less confrontational way, but
Yep.
at the end of the day, like everyone wants to make a better product, to be more secure, and that focusing on that will really get the feedback to stick.
Yeah, it also gets back to this concept of truth seeking, where you and your, say, interlocutor are trying to arrive at some understanding, some shared mutual understanding of the truth, without sort of implicitly casting blame by saying, "Oh, this is how I think it should be." So I really like that. Let's see. I think we have hit on all our topics for the day. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today, Eugene?
No, I think that's pretty good. I really like again the truth seeking theme about this, and kind of bringing that out in communication. I think one of the things then is that if you have multiple truths, competing truths in a security program, and I think that's a whole other part of communication that's also important to consider as well. How do you
That
then
is, yeah.
navigate
What do you,
this?
like,
Yeah.
you have two competing incentives or directives. The heck do you do? Yeah, that's really difficult. I don't know if we want to dive into that. That could be like the next
Yeah,
webinar,
sure.
the next live stream. Okay, so Eugene, this was really great. It's really a pleasure speaking with you. If I can give you some feedback in the form of not a question, but a statement, it is that I really like how you structure your thoughts and how you say what you want to say and then you say it. That's really good, and I like that a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I love your questions as well. Really got me to think deeper about what I was going to say.
My pleasure. Let's definitely do this again, whether on stream or off. I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to speaking with you. Where can people find you if they are interested in learning more about what you do?
Yeah, so I have a blog, spaceraccoon.dev, DEV, and on X, I'm spaceraccoonsec. Someone still has Space Raccoon for some reason. And yeah,
You didn't
feel
hack
free to
them?
reach out. No, I'm an ethical. Yeah. So yeah.
All right, so we will do that. And just to end this off, I do want to mention that we just today are publishing a new learning path on red teaming. So that's really exciting. It is taking the material that we teach in Pen 300 and then taking it a step further, saying, okay, but what happens if you have a blue team, some defenders that are trying to stop you? Well, here's some of our answer to that question. It is not a full course by any means. It's not a narrative from A to Z. It's just a few modules on some real cool red teaming techniques. We also have an IoT path that we're publishing as well. And again, not a comprehensive course, a learning path that covers some basics of embedded systems and firmware analysis and attacking firmware. So check those out. Really excited about those. And I think that's it for today. So Eugene, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.
Cool. Thank you.